All right, so let's get this underway. Thanks for hopping in to join me. I don't know how long this is going to take. I hope it'll be no more than 30 minutes, but the idea is I'm kickstarting something new this week, something which for now I'm calling Immigration News and Predictions. Maybe there's a better title for it. We'll figure it out. And the idea is that I don't have to tell you, the Trump regime is flooding the zone so often and so furiously with so much shit. It's challenging to know where to look. And that makes it even harder to connect the dots on any one issue, which is part of their plan, right? To keep us demoralized and distracted. So, as I make it my job to keep up on all the latest maneuvers in immigration, I thought I would share them. Having written Crossing the Line, my lens on the issue is both deep and broad, and it has also been, at certain points, predictive. For example, I warned in my book that if allowed to invade the White House a second time, they would turn ICE and CBP into paramilitary Gestapo forces. I did warn that the gulag of prisons and the transportation infrastructure bequeathed to them by a 40-plus year bipartisan project that whittled away legal protections and human rights commitments, that they would harness that to to drive our democracy into crisis. Those of you who have heard me speak will know that I truly believe that it is immigration, that immigration is the touchstone issue, that all other issues under this regime come back to or emanate from immigration in some way, not the least of which is that the regime currently in power, as I said, has weaponized immigration to drive U.S. democracy into crisis. So, to help you keep up and to offer, hopefully, some informed predictions of what's likely coming, I thought I'd give this aggregation of immigration news a try. So here we go, and I hope you'll let me know when we're done if you think this was a valuable use of your time, excuse me. So the second week of February 2026 will be remembered for Senate Democrats finally standing up to the Trump regime's cruelty, impunity, and complete abrogation of the Constitution and the rule of law. Democrats recognized, finally, that Homan's ICE has been targeting law abiding immigrant families, not criminals and felons, not the worst of the worst. They are the worst of the worst. They acknowledged, the Democrats, finally, that occupying U.S. cities and brutalizing U.S. communities is not okay. They demanded, finally, that Nome's Department of Homeland Security rein ICE agents in, perhaps forgetting that the reign of terror and the damage being inflicted is not limited to just one of the regime's paramilitary goon squads, but that the U.S. Border Patrol, since 1924, has led the charge that was brought to U.S. streets under Gregory Bovino's hideous command. And keep in mind that the Border Patrol in 1924 was a rebranding of the KKK and the Texas Rangers, which is what the slave patrols became when the Civil War put an end to the enslavement and torture, lifelong torture of the many for the profit of the few. So the Border Patrol have always fulfilled this kind of bounty hunter role, and now ICE has been unleashed to take on that role too. Now, Senate Democrats are demanding finally that ICE play by its own stated rules. What are these rules? That agents obtain a judicial warrant before storming people's homes, before bashing their way into people's cars, before destroying private property and taking innocent lives, believing themselves to be above accountability. which they are not. It means that ICE agents be qualified to wear a badge, that they even wear a badge rather than a mask, as well as body caps, and that they be trained to know the difference between enforcing the law and using excessive force, not provoked with promises of bounty payouts, to act with impunity, to meet some whack job quota decreed by an unelected white supremacist member of this lawless regime. It means that ICE agents stay away from sensitive locations like schools and hospitals and houses of worship and polling sites, lest they inflict more lifelong trauma on our children, on our families, on the elderly, on everybody, really, and that ICE agents act like representatives of a democratic society, not like conscripted soldiers of a dirty war era death squad, which is what they seem like now. So speaking for his colleagues, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat of New York, told National Public Radio, quote, "We simply believe, as a value proposition, that immigration enforcement in this country should be fair. It should be just. It should be humane," which I've illustrated in my book, Crossing the Line, Finding America in the Borderlands, has been inhumane for decades under the direction of Republicans and Democratic leadership alike. And Jeffries must know this. His Senate colleagues sure do, because on the same day that MAGA Republicans decided that they would rather shut down the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Coast Guard, the Transportation Security Administration, rather than attempt to stuff the evil ICE genie back into its bottle, on February 13th, the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations published a scathing, comprehensive report following a 10-month investigation that proves that the United States of America has joined other shadowy transnational criminal organizations in the trafficking of human beings. That's what's happening. Commissioned by Democratic members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which includes Ranking Member Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, Chris Coons of Delaware, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Tim Kaine of Virginia, Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, Cory Booker of New Jersey, Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, and Jackie Rosen of Nevada. The report bears evidence that the Trump regime is engaging in secret third country deportations, just like a human trafficking syndicate would. It details how these secret deals are committing gross human rights violations and that they are being carried out at an extortionist cost to us, the taxpayer. So here's the thing. These deportations to third countries have so far, according to this report, cost upward of $40 million. But the true cost still really isn't known. What we do know is that over $32 million was sent directly to Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda, El Salvador, Eswatini, and Palau, with funds sent in some cases before any third country nationals arrived in these locations. For example, the Rwandan government was paid $7.5 million as of January 2026. Also, as of that time, it has received only 7 individuals. So that's approximately $1.1 million per person. And that doesn't include the cost to ICE to have hunted these people down, kidnap them, and enslave them in the ICE's expanding network of concentration camps. So this is how much we're spending on this deportation effort. Palau is another example. It has not received any third country nationals as of January, yet they have already received 7.5 million U.S. taxpayer dollars. Again, at the same time that MAGA has ripped away Medicaid from about 14 million Americans, legislated a $1 trillion cut to Medicaid, the largest in American history, stolen food from the mouths of hungry children, from seniors, from veterans, with a $186 billion cut to SNAP. You know about all of this. All the while they're providing massive tax breaks to GOP billionaire donors. They've created this $75 billion slush fund for untrained and masked ICE agents to be violently unleashed on our communities. Deportation costs soar to more than $32,000 per hour, furthermore, when the regime uses military aircraft rather than charter airlines, as was the case last March when they tossed more than 250 people, largely innocent of any crime, into El Salvadoran dictator Nayib Bukele's torture chambers, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. El Salvador was paid over $5 million for that crime against humanity, to which we are now all complicit, at a cost of over $20,000 per person. So let me repeat, this is not diplomacy. This is human trafficking. It is human trafficking that can only lead to one result: the potential genocide of a heretofore unrecognized class of people, which I'm going to call the stateless. Okay? So here's another example. On February 14th, 2026, the day after the release of the Foreign Relations Committee report, the New York Times disclosed that in January 2026, the Trump administration flew 9 people, nearly all of whom had been granted U.S. court protections from being sent back to their home countries, to the African nation of Cameroon, which, as I write about in Crossing the Line, is embroiled in a civil war that is creating its own internally displaced and refugee populations. None of the 9 expelled from the U.S. on that January flight hail from Cameroon, according to government documents obtained by the Times and lawyers for these deportees. Nor has Marco Rubio's State Department made public that it has struck a deal with Cameroon to accept deportees from other nations. The 9 have been detained since the time of their expulsion at a state-owned compound in the capital city of Yaoundé, where they are being extorted to buy back their freedom. U.S. and Cameroon are once again, as they were in 2020, which I divulge in my book, they are once again partners in human rights violations. Cameroon is not safe for its own citizens. It is not safe for third country nationals being deported by the U.S. federal government. And not only are Cameroon authorities arbitrarily detaining these non-Cameroonian nationals deported from the United States, but a February 20th Human Rights Watch report also discloses that the journalists and attorneys who tried to intervene and advocate for and interview these people have been beaten up. They've suffered hideous physical abuses. So, and then on top of it all, my Flight Watch colleagues and I watched in horror as yet another plane landed in Cameroon this week. So Cameroon is in on the human trafficking game. This happened also on September 5th, when one of my friend's clients, a young woman who'd fled female genital mutilation and had been granted asylum at a court deep inside the rotten and stinking bowels of the prison profiteer CoreCivic's Eloy concentration camp in Arizona, she was removed from the facility and trafficked in chains to Ghana in a U.S. Air Force transport. Now, she thought she was being released from ICE detention. Imagine. She'd told me that she'd been told by a U.S. judge sitting under the medallion of the U.S. Department of Justice. He said, "I am granting you asylum." He told her, "The next time ICE comes for you, it will be to release you." And sure enough, when they did come for her and they made her wait 3 more months in this horrible detention center, ICE agents said to her, "You are being released." But they lied because they put her on a plane and they sent that plane to the Alexandra Staging Facility in Louisiana, which is this purpose-built detention and deportation hub managed by prison profiteer Geo Group. And there they shackled her and they forced her onto an Air Force cargo plane with a dozen other individuals, all of whom I interviewed about 7 of them, all of whom, according to their reports, enjoyed some form of judicial protection in the United States and believed themselves to be safe. They were not even afforded the comfort of a flight seat. They were buckled into benches, bolted to either side of the plane's fuselage. 5 of them, all men, were bound in the wrap for the duration of the flight. I write about how ICE Arrow, enforcement and removals operations, SWAT teams, use this human restraint device called the wrap to force compliance on the many through the torture of the few in chapter 33 of my book. Then what happened was this agency of the U.S. federal government just dropped these folks into a military black site in the Ghanaian jungle. Now, none of them were from Ghana. And after being denied contact with their family, with their legal representatives for several weeks, 2 weeks, I think it was, they were not provided adequate food. They were not given any medical attention. They were all being eaten up by insects and they were getting malaria and they had no clean bathrooms. So finally, the government of Ghana responded by bundling these people up into a series of military transports, driving them through the night to the border with Togo, and frog marching them across that border in the dead of night. They were told, "You're on your own." The women were given $40 cash. The men were given nothing. So using Tom Homan's hideous language, they were rendered illegals in Togo, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer, when they had all been legals in the United States. And sadly, I have since lost track of many of them. I do not know if they are still in hiding. I do not know if they've been imprisoned in Togo or elsewhere. I don't know if they've lost their lives. And I don't know if my original source has now suffered the mutilation she fled. But this is what is going to happen to people who are removed from the United States to a random other country where they know no one, where they do not speak the language, where they will not have the opportunity to feed themselves and support themselves and get back to their families. It's hideous. So now my colleagues and I watch in horror as Omni Air International and Journey Aviation, their tail numbers now masked like ICE and Border Patrol goons that populate these planes, are packing aircraft full to bursting with unknown individuals and trafficking them to Ghana, to Cameroon, to Chad. We've traced them to Equatorial Guinea, to Benin, to Senegal and Nigeria. And these are only the flights we've managed to be able to see. So with this broadcast, I aim not only to highlight the extraordinary secrecy that surrounds Trump and Co.'s global human trafficking efforts, the murky deals forged with willing collaborators, often in exchange for cash, through which the U.S. has already deported hundreds of people to foreign countries that may not respect the removal protections that they were granted in the U.S., returning them to the dangers they fled, which is an international crime called refoulement, in this kind of chain deportation mechanism. I also want to emphasize that in order to expel this quantity of individuals from our country to others, whether or not their own, the nation, once beloved as the land of laws, the beacon of hope for those yearning to live free, the so-called leader of the free world, is now building a rapidly expanding internal concentration camp network to facilitate these deportation efforts. And I want to remind everyone of the horrors that take place out of sight and out of mind on these in-flight Abu Ghraibs, colloquially referred to as ice air. Indeed, I published a podcast episode just this week on my Substack about what actually happens on, again, these ice air boxcars in the sky. I welcome you to check it out. This is something we don't think about. It's becoming more and more apparent of the abuses that are taking place inside detention. But once they're whisked away, all evidence of human rights abuses are whisked away with them. And it's much, much harder to track. So we need to know what happens on an ice air deportation transport. But Returning to the rapidly expanding Gulag, there are now approximately 70,000 people incarcerated on any given day under egregious conditions in the United States, and these people have largely committed no crime. This is according to ICE researcher Austin Coker. I highly recommend, if you're not following him on Substack already, to do so. These include children like Liam Conejo Ramos, no threat to any society. These include ICE's youngest prisoner, Juan Nicolas, who was deported with a potentially fatal bout of bronchitis this week. These include pregnant women who should be exempt from incarceration. And these include mothers torn from their children by representatives of the U.S. government who have been landing every day since Inauguration Day 2025 in airports around the world, frantic for knowledge about where their kids are and who is taking care of them. This is the new face of family separation. The one too few of us see, because the regime is deliberately flooding us with so much horror at home to distract us from the horrors they are committing abroad. Thankfully, we have the Women's Refugee Commission. They are on the ground in Central America, monitoring the real effects to humanity of Trump's deportation campaign. Their February 1, 2026 report documents that what is happening is tantamount to a new form of forced family separation, quote, one that stands out because of the speed and scale at which it is happening and the particular way in which impacted people are being targeted. And by that, they mean parents are being picked up during routine traffic stops. They are being apprehended outside of their children's schools after they drop them off for the day, and they are being disappeared on their way to work, then trafficked in chains to ICE black sites as far from home and from their legal representatives as possible, then forced out of the country, sometimes within days, without any due process under the law, often leaving their children and loved ones completely unaware that they were even taken. And here's a horror I predict we will start to see more of just over the horizon. This is thanks to Ruth Ben-Ghiat's latest speaker on her Substack, Lucid. Again, highly recommend you subscribe to Lucid if you haven't already. She does these weekly webinars. And the one just last week was with a health professional. He's also very concerned because we're starting to hear about measles outbreaks in some of these U.S. concentration camps, and not just one, but there are measles outbreaks at several. They're far apart, so the contagion is not contained within one. Sorry, that's my dog. Anyway, we're starting to hear about these outbreaks, and it's particularly happening in the prisons that are detaining children with their parents, like at Dilley in Texas. So what happens when the sick get expelled to a country that might not be their own, that might not have the infrastructure to take care of such contagious diseases? Well, We saw this during the first Trump regime under COVID. What happens is that the United States becomes a purveyor of communicable disease. And this is even more tragic now that we have no more USAID holding up medical infrastructures abroad. So again, this is a country that somehow doesn't believe in vaccines anymore, that has killed the Center for Disease Control, and a once controlled communicable illness like the measles could become the next killer of children in lands abroad. If that happens, remember, it was caused potentially by the United States federal government. Similarly, in a U.S. that has banned abortion and denied access to medical care to more and more of its residents, women are having to give birth at home, where their children will not be immediately registered. So much for birthright citizenship. If you are undocumented and giving birth outside of a hospital setting, you might not actually get that benefit under the Constitution. I think they're doing that deliberately. Now, another point about the growing concentration camp gulag. Bloomberg News reported on January 29th, 2026, and we've seen a lot of reports since then, that with funds gifted to the regime through last summer's MAGA murder mandate, what folks more diplomatic than I refer to as the Big Ugly Bill, Nome's Department of Homeland Security is buying up as many as 23 mega warehouses for use as immigration prisons. This is happening all across the United States, pointing to the largest expansion of detention capacity in U.S. history. The cost for acquiring just 2 of these warehouses alone, one in Hagerstown, Maryland, and the other in Surprise, Arizona, which was paid for in cash, was $172 million. A third in El Paso, Texas, could be among the largest immigration jails we've ever seen built in this country before. If completed as envisioned, it would hold as many as 8,500 beds. Under the previous Trump regime, Department of Homeland Security relied on tent camps constructed in remote places very, very quickly, like at Homestead Air Reserve Base in the Florida Everglades, in remote Tornillo, Texas. Honey, I'm on live. You need to stop barking. Inside El Paso's Fort Bliss. Thanks, Jim. Acquiring e-commerce distribution facilities represents a prelude, I hate to say it, to the commission of a new Holocaust. I kid you not. Paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, starting with the $44 billion earmarked in the Big Ugly for the immigration detention build-out. Folks like Representative Jeffries and Senator Shaheen surely saw coming, because they at least had the foresight to vote against the MAGA murder mandate. Human rights attorney Kasim Rashid asks in a February 13th Substack post, is the Trump regime committing genocide? To which I answered yes. Indeed, in writing Crossing the Line, that was the alarm I wished to sound, though at the time I was forbidden from using the G word by my editor, who thought at that point that it might sound too much like a conspiracy theory, that it might sound too hyperbolic. In fact, she nixed my original book title, which was The First Solution, by which I wanted to signal, even then, that our immigration system was ripe for being harnessed as a tool for mass death and destruction worldwide. So, am I hyperbolizing? Consider this. In his February 10th weekly roundup for the Hopium Chronicles, Simon Rosenberg provides the math. Here it is. 3,000 kidnappings a day, which is, evil Stephen Miller's quota, translates to about 1 million people incarcerated in U.S. concentration camps each year. The concentration camps are black site staging grounds for this expulsion effort, right? That's why I call it the detention. Sorry, yeah, that's why I call it the detention to deportation pipeline. So if the regime's shadow president and hate monger in chief, Stephen Miller, achieves his fever dream of expelling all Black and brown people heretofore denied a pathway to citizenship in the United States at no fault of their own, an elusive number believed to be in the neighborhood of 11 to 12 million, but which MAGA mouthpieces like Miller have been known to exaggerate to 15 or 20 million, states Simon Rosenberg, we will be living with Trump and co.'s reign and terror for another decade, maybe two. 1 million a year, 20 million people. That's a lot of years. That's what they're doing. They're building up this concentration camp infrastructure in these warehouses versus in these canvas tents because they can see, if they get their way, that this is going to have to go on for a very, very long time. So that is why I say we are on the verge, if we haven't started already, to committing genocide against stateless people. And Senate Democrats now just seek to reign. Let me see if I can say this another way. The coming genocide of stateless people already underway. Senate Democrats now seek to rein in with body cams and a few extra weeks of training. I don't know, people. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, the cruelty is not okay. And what we need to understand is that it didn't begin with Trump. It didn't begin with Trump and co. He and Miller and Homan, Bovino, Noem, all the others who are hell-bent on whitewashing the United States electorate were bequeathed a system, as I said, a system that was created by elected officials on both sides of the political aisle that has now become a sharp spear piercing the heart of U.S. democracy. Trump and co. first harnessed immigration to drive our democracy into crisis. They are now broadening the detention to deportation pipeline that I expose in my book into a sprawling global human trafficking network of mass refoulement, or returning people to harm, which, as I said, is a crime under international law. And in so doing, they are on track to committing history's next genocide. And what is most heartbreaking is that this entire episode could have been avoided if our elected representatives had truly valued human rights back in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and in the 2010s. And yes, I am pointing the finger at Clinton, at Obama, at Biden. Democrats and Republicans alike have brought us to this wretched place. Once again, to understand what it's like to be forced onto an ice air Abu Ghraib, I encourage you to read or listen to Chapter 32 of Crossing the Line. It's called Locked Up. If you've got the book, it's the only public document to detail what actually happens on these boxcars in the sky. You can get it in print, audio, or ebook, but I also did do a podcast episode of that chapter, focused on that chapter 4 from the Borderlands, just last week. So you can find just that chapter on my Substack if you'd like. And in closing, I want to say this. The only answer is abolition, truly. This system cannot be reformed. It must be reimagined. And until we can do that, which we can't do until we get rid of these fascist effers, excuse my French, the best we can do is each and every one of us become a million tiny grains of sand, throwing ourselves into this machinery of misery and gumming up the gears at least until we can get rid of this regime. So call and write your members of Congress, tell them no more money for DHS. The crybabies and liars would oops, what's that? Oh, I don't know what happened. There we go. The crybabies and liars would like you to believe that their domestic terror organizations don't have enough cash. Call bullshit on that. ICE and CBP, which includes the Border Patrol, are funded until 2029 thanks to the MAGA murder mandate. They will be paid throughout any government shutdown. They will never cease to be paid. So call bullshit on that. The only agencies that are harmed by this shutdown are the ones we need, like FEMA and other agencies that are set up in times to support us in times of need. So join me, please, in shouting from the rooftops that this is not the nation we wish to be. For now, let's all be Minnesota. That's all for this session on immigration news and predictions. Stay strong, my friends. The only way through this is together. Sorry about that. Let me know if you think this was worth your time, and I will do it again. And Jarrett, yes, Pastor Stephen is free. He walks free in Vermont once more. Thank you for asking. Let me see if there are any other questions. Nope. All right, that's it for now, folks. Thanks for coming, and do let me know if you thought this was worth your while. Cheers. Bye-bye.